2 weeks ago, in the middle of the Muslim observance of Ramadan, a terrible tragedy occurred on the Jewish holiday of Lag BaOmer at Mount Meron in the north of Israel, when 45 Jews died in a tragic accident. In the days that followed, tens of thousands of other Jews who had come up for the Lag BaOmer celebration were stranded without a way to get home. And Arab Israelis from the villages that surround Mount Meron came out with water and food and offers of shelter to the many ultra-Orthodox Jews who were stranded there. It was a heartbreaking moment for the Jewish people, made just a tiny bit easier by the window that opened into what coexistence between Jews and Arabs could look like. Didn't make the news here, of course. That moment now feels like it was years ago instead of weeks. How does your heart feel this evening? With immense sadness and anger, I speak tonight not for the first time in the midst of a serious escalation in violence in Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. I'm holding in my heart, as I know many of you are at this difficult time, our friends, our family, and loved ones who are in the line of fire. I spoke yesterday to people like Rabbi Gabi Dagan, our friend in Haifa, and to other close friends who have spent the past days and nights in fear. I'm thinking as well of all the Israeli and Palestinian families who are grieving losses and tending to their wounded. While this moment bears resemblance to painful memories of prior rounds of conflict, the present violence feels at the same time radically different and possibly even more scary. Some observers are calling the past 5 days a civil war within Israel itself, and as unprecedented scenes of fighting and violence are playing out in mixed Jewish-Arab cities in Israel. And now, tragically, with Hamas and other terrorist groups in Gaza firing more than 1,700 rockets indiscriminately at Israeli cities, and Israel responding with massive airstrikes, there have been at least 103 Palestinians killed in Gaza and the West Bank, and at least 8 Israelis killed in Israel proper, including, horrifically, children on both sides. And many, many more have been wounded. I, for one, have no ambivalence about what Israel is doing right now. When many hundreds of rockets are being launched against Israel from terrorists with no moral compass and in no need of pretext or provocation, Israel has the right, as any nation would, to defend itself. The Jewish people and the land and people of Israel are my family, and I will always put my family first. I will always think of them first, always wonder how they are doing before I think about anyone else. I don't know if that makes me a good person or a bad person, but it's how I think. It's how I feel. And tonight, my heart, as the medieval poet Yehuda Halevi wrote, is in the East. And I don't mean on the Upper East Side. And what I've learned about the human heart is that it is expansive. Indeed, it has many rooms. I've realized in my life that I can feel many feelings at once. I can care about more than one thing at the same time. I can feel compassion for more than one person at the same time. I can know in my heart that a decision I made in a crisis was the correct one. And know at the same time that when the crisis passes, my heart will have to ask other hard questions about what led to the crisis and what I need to do to help ensure that such a crisis doesn't happen again. Hearts are amazing that way. They can be broken and then repaired, empty and then full, filled with doubt one moment and confident that they know the truth in the next. One heart with many rooms, with a massive capacity for feeling its way through complexity. My heart is with my friends and family across Israel who are running back and forth from shelters or have simply given up and started putting their children to sleep in safe rooms. And my heart is big enough to be with parents and children in Gaza who have no shelters to run to and who can only sit in their homes in unsubsiding fear. My heart is sick at the senseless deaths of far too many innocent Israelis and Palestinians. And my heart is broken by the lynchings and mob attacks perpetrated by both Arabs and Jews, and by the fracturing of society throughout the land. I care about my people, the Jewish people, above all others. And I have compassion for Arab Israelis and Palestinians, the vast majority of whom, like the vast majority of Jewish Israelis, simply want to raise their children in safety. I believe that the actions that Israel is taking right now are justified. And I believe that Israelis and Palestinians both must examine their moral and ethical and political behavior in this moment and beyond, if this cycle of violence is not to just end, not to just be a ceasefire, but to actually end. As my friend and Israeli educator Leah Solomon wrote this week, quote, "We can never allow ourselves to accept as inevitable the utter terror that Israelis are experiencing as they flee from hundreds of rockets, that Palestinians in Gaza are experiencing as 14-story apartment buildings are bombed into smithereens, or that Jewish and Arab citizens across Israel are experiencing as nationalist mobs torch cars, burn down buildings, and lynch innocent passersby. The primary short-term goal for every Israeli and Palestinian leader at this moment must be to achieve an absolute and immediate cessation of all violence. But lack of violence is not peace. And lack of violence does not on its own advance justice, rights, or long-term security for either side. The tragedy of this situation is that we know, Israel knows, Hamas knows, that this cycle of retaliation, rockets, and more retaliation will do nothing to provide long-term security for Israelis and will only leave more devastation for Gaza, many more deaths and injuries, and deeper fear and hate in its wake. And I'm also holding the profound awareness that simply returning to the way things were before this outbreak of violence cannot be our end goal either. The Biden administration clearly came into office wanting to take a hands-off approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We American Jews must demand that they engage and make this conflict a priority once again. Even if it's not at the very top of the administration's priority list, a hands-off approach is not a serious policy for a crisis one of our key allies is facing. Inattention to the conflict allows tensions to escalate that can then explode into precisely the kind of violence we have witnessed over the past 5 days and more. The administration's top priority now must be to get Israel and Hamas to de-escalate and agree to a ceasefire. And then the real work of coexistence can and must begin, because there is no alternative that Israel can live with. This is such a painful moment for Israel and all those who love her. Perhaps you will find it hard tonight to find room in your heart for anything other than the anger and pain that you feel for what Israel and Israelis are going through. That's okay. That's mostly where I am too tonight. Perhaps you have no room in your heart in the midst of a war for anything other than compassion for Palestinians and their plight. I know that even if that's hard for some of us to hear, there are Jews that feel that way, and we must see them. Because just telling them that they're not allowed to feel that won't actually change how they feel, won't actually mend their heart. Perhaps there are those who are finding it hard to find room in their hearts for anything other than anger at the failure of imagination of both Israeli and Palestinian leaders to break this cycle. That's okay too. I know that I can't tell you how to feel any more than you can tell me how to feel. If you're feeling one of these things more than the other, I see you, I hear you. And Israel needs you. She needs us all. It's actually valuable, not problematic in my view, to have Jews who feel each of these feelings, because our hearts know that there is so much complexity in this situation. And it's valuable, not problematic, because collectively our hearts are big enough to recognize the pain of Israeli Jews and the pain of Israeli Arabs and Palestinians and the failings of both of their leaders to do what needs to be done to bring peace to all. After the violence ceases, may it be soon. I call on every Jew who cares about the future of the Jewish people in the land of Israel to hold tightly to the sense of urgency that we feel right now, to not let go, and to work, not just for a lack of violence, but for a future of justice, security, equality, freedom, and flourishing for all. For the sake of Zion and Jerusalem, we cannot allow ourselves to be silent, not ever, and certainly not now. If we're going to envision the kind of Israel we want, we cannot allow even states of emergency to shut our hearts down completely. Our hearts not only have capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously. For the future of Israel and the Jewish people everywhere, our hearts must have room for our Jewish family when they are in pain, and they are in pain tonight. And for the future of Israel and Jewish people everywhere, our hearts must have room for compassion for innocent Israeli Arabs and Palestinians as well. And for not only the physical well-being of the state of Israel that we love, but for the well-being of her soul. Our hearts must be big enough to ask what both sides need to do going forward and how they need to do it. Friends, some stories aren't making the news this week. Like the story of an Arab village in the north of Israel called Zarzir, where the other day first, a bunch of Arab hooligans threatened a school bus full of Jewish kids on their way home from dance class. And then the Arab mayor of Zarzir sent a video message out to all the Jewish and Arab villages around decrying this act. And then Arabs and Israelis came out to protest together in the main intersection of Zarzir, one next to another, to say, this is not the future we envision. Also not making much news are the equally true stories of Israeli Jewish families cooking food for their Israeli Muslim neighbors this week as they celebrate Eid al-Fitr, the end of a long month of sacred fasting. And we're not hearing the stories of Jewish mothers and their children and Arab mothers and their children hiding together in the stairwells of apartment buildings in Yafo as the rocket sirens wail. Our hearts are breaking in this moment. We all know what heartbreak feels like. It's terrible. And we also know what it feels like when hearts heal, when hearts meet, when hearts feel their way through external differences to see another human being in pain. Tonight, I pray not just for a cessation of violence, but for a healing of hearts. To close, I'd like to share a brand new poem composed by Ido Katz, a member of Kibbutz Gevim in Shar HaNegev, a town adjacent to the Gaza Strip that we visited on our congregational trip to Israel in 2018. Ido is a member of a Reform synagogue in Shar HaNegev led by Rabbi Yael Vargan. I'm grateful that Marla Gamron, chair of our Israel Engagement Committee, has agreed to share the reading of this poem with me. All I could think of when I heard it yesterday was if Ido, sitting in a bomb shelter with his family less than a mile away from the Gaza Strip, could write these words, perhaps there's still room in my broken heart tonight. I'll invite Marla to join me.
Hi, Rabbi.
Can we spotlight both Marla and I? Is that possible to do, Rachel? Thank you.
זו מלחמה שאין לה כיוון.
This is a war without direction.
עוד סיבוב של מסרים.
Another round of sending messages.
עוד מאבק בין גברים.
Another conflict between men.
של if you have to shoot, shoot and don't talk.
Of if you have to shoot, shoot and don't talk.
זה טבוע בנו עמוק.
It is deeply ingrained in us.
זה עמק השווה.
Finding middle ground. מישהו יכול לומר או לחשוב?
Can anyone say or think?
מה זה שווה?
What is it worth?
ולמה זה טוב?
And what good does this do?
ומה זה רוצה להנהיג?
And where will this lead?
והאם לא הגיע הזמן מזמן
And hasn't the time long come
להחליף טילים ומילים,
to trade missiles for missives,
להוציא אותן מהימחים,
to remove the emergency stockpiles,
לעשות בהן שימוש ממוקד,
to make targeted use of them, לפתח אותם, להשחיז ולדייק,
to develop them, sharpen them, make them precise,
לתרגם משפה לשפה,
to translate them from one language to another,
לנסות לאחות נרטיבים,
to try to reconcile narratives,
להפגיש כאב עם כאב,
to bring together pain with pain,
פעם אחת סופית ולתמיד.
once and for all,
להקשיב ולא רק להשיב,
to listen and not just respond,
לתת להם לשבת בפנים,
to let them sit inside,
לשבת, להבשיל, לעורר,
to sit, to ripen, to awaken,
לגעת ללב,
to touch the heart,
ללבן ולשלב.
to clarify and to combine. לתת למשהו אחר מתוך זה להתגשם.
To allow something else to emerge.
והכל באמת יכול להיות פה.
But truly, everything is possible here.
כל כך אחר.
It could be so different.
Shabbat shalom.